The Ozark Mountains in 1931 were not the kind of place where strangers felt at ease. The land was beautiful. Yes, rolling ridges of limestone, endless hollows that swallowed the sunlight, creeks twisting through the timber like veins of glass. But beneath that beauty, there was something else. Something quiet. Something that did not care for outsiders. On the outskirts of Washington County, Arkansas, there was a place known as Devil's Den, a curious formation of rocks and caves, shrouded by thick oak and pine. Locals spoke of it rarely, and when the name did slip into conversation, it did so in hushed tones, as if just speaking it aloud might invite trouble. To most, Devil's Den was just an outcrop, the perfect hunting ground, a good spot for fishing. But to others, it was a place of memory and warning. The year was heavy with hardship. The Great Depression had swept through Arkansas like a wildfire no one could put out. Families scraped by with what they could, making do with patched clothes, bartered goods, and stomachs half full. In small towns scattered across the Ozarks, Sunday sermons offered hope against despair. But even in the brightest churches, belief in God was shadowed by something older, something that had existed in the mountains long before steeples rose against the horizon. That spring of '31, unsettling rumors began to stir among farmers and townsfolk alike. Livestock were found mutilated in their pens, with no sign of predator tracks. Strange chanting was said to echo through Devil's Den long after midnight, carried down the ridges until it mingled with the mist-heavy air of dawn. Some swore they had seen faint fires flickering deep in the woods, where no homesteader had any right to be at such an hour. Folks who lived nearest the den whispered that it was cursed ground, a place where the soil itself clung to old blood. They claimed the hill folk who had come before the towns, those who settled in the mid-1800s, had performed rites there, darker than any hymn. Rites not meant for human eyes. And though most dismissed such tales as nothing more than mountain gossip, there was a strange consistency in what was told. The stories aligned too neatly, as though generations were passing down something they dared not forget. That's where this story begins, not in the chaos of the Great Depression, but in the quiet dread of a mountain hollow where secrecy had been cultivated for nearly a century. For Devil's Den was not just a name carved into the map. It was, and had long been, a threshold. It was in early May when Sheriff Clyde Kinslow first heard reports worth investigating. Clyde had kept Washington County in check for nearly 15 years, a gruff but steady man with a reputation for keeping the law while knowing when to turn a blind eye. He understood the Ozarks were not like other places. A sheriff couldn't watch every hollow, couldn't climb every ridge. In many ways, each family policed its own, and Clyde's job was as much about maintaining order as avoiding unnecessary feud. But what was happening near Devil's Den was different. This was not cattle rustling. It was not drunken brawls or moonshining disputes. This had the smell of something far worse. When he sat at his desk in the small Bentonville courthouse, scribbling down the third report in less than 10 days, Clyde leaned back in his chair and stared at the oil lamp, restless. 3 separate homesteads, 3 different accounts, all pointing to the same hollow. The livestock, always goats or calves, were drained of blood, their hides cut with strange precision. No wolves. No men he knew of. At least not any sane men. Clyde didn't believe in old folklore. Not really. He had been raised by Baptist parents who scorned superstition. But still, he could not shake the unease that had crept into his bones. The sheriff was not the only one who noticed. Across town, Lydia Harper, a 30-year-old widow working nights at a boarding house, heard the rumors like everyone else. But unlike most, she had a connection to the land itself. Lydia had grown up beneath the canopy of Devil's Denver. She knew its caves, its limestone walls, the way its paths coiled back on themselves. She also knew the other side of the stories, the ones her grandmother warned her never to repeat, the ones spoken when lanterns burned low, and the world outside seemed more shadow than substance. To Lydia, the rumors didn't sound like pure superstition. They sounded like return, a cycle, repeating itself. She could still remember her grandmother's trembling voice telling her of a night, decades ago, when men gathered in a circle by torchlight and something unholy, was invoked below the cliffs. And so, when reports surfaced that spring, Lydia kept her silence. Some knowledge was better left unspoken, better left buried in the valley itself. But the Ozarks have never been kind to secrets. By mid-May, things escalated. A farmhand named Roy Cattleman was found wandering out of the den in near delirium, his clothes torn, his skin scratched and blistered, as though he had been dragged across stone. He spoke of whispers in the dark, voices he could not see. He said he had seen a circle of figures cloaked in black, and that something moved in the center, something alive but not human. Within a week, Roy was gone, packed up what little he owned and caught a train west, leaving his wages behind. He left in such haste it rattled the community. All eyes turned back to Devil's Den. For Sheriff Clyde Kinslow, this was now unavoidable. He gathered 2 deputies and declared they would walk the caves themselves, see with their own eyes whether lawless men were truly at work there. Townsfolk gathered in knots to whisper. Farmers hitched up wagons earlier than usual, wanting no part in the shadows gathering in the hollow. But Lydia Harper knew better. She knew that men with stars on their chest could carry rifles into the mountains all they wanted, but if Devil's Den was waking again, rifles would not matter. For Devil's Den was not about men, or rifles, or even the law. It was about what the land remembered. That night, the fog settled thicker than usual, smothering the ridges in silence. Lanterns flickered along empty porches. Hounds whined in their kennels. Somewhere in the woods, a sound rose faint and rhythmic, as though the mountain itself was breathing. And those who lived nearest closed their shutters, locked their doors, and prayed the whispers they heard were only tricks of the wind. Dawn came with a gray sky, low-hanging and heavy with spring rain. Sheriff Clyde Kinslow pushed back his chair from the courthouse desk and adjusted the brim of his hat. It was time. He had put it off long enough. The townspeople wanted answers, and he would be the one to find them, or at least appear as though he had. Standing by the hitching post were his 2 deputies. Earl Whitmore, a lanky fellow barely past 25, carried his shotgun with both hands, knuckles pale from gripping it too tightly. He had courage, Clyde thought, but most of it came from inexperience. The other deputy, Harlan Jenkins, was close to Clyde's own age, with a weathered jaw and eyes that carried too many sleepless nights. Jenkins had lived long enough to know that Devil's Den was not just rock and timber. He had grown up hearing the whispers, too. As the 3 men set out on horseback, the courthouse square was unusually quiet. A handful of early risers had gathered, blacksmiths, barbers, mothers with flour-stained aprons, as if watching them off onto some war front rather than a patrol through the hills. No one said much. A few nodded silently, but most stood stiff, eyes fixed on the dirt, as though acknowledging them at all might bring bad luck. The ride through the morning fog was slow. Hooves clopped against wet stone, while crows stirred from branches overhead. The closer they traveled toward the thick ridgeline where Devil's Den cut into the earth, the more the silence seemed to press in, swallowing the horseman whole. Sheriff Clyde kept his eyes forward. "We go straight through the main pass," he said firmly. "No splitting up. No chasing shadows. We'll see the cave system circle the ridge and turn back before dark." He told himself it was practical, but in truth it was fear that drew the boundaries. By noon, the men arrived at the mouth of Devil's Den, an opening in the limestone that looked less like natural formation and more like an old wound, scabbed over with moss and shadow. The cliff wall arched above them, jagged and unforgiving. Pools of water rippled in the long grass where spring rains had collected. "Looks like any other cave," Earl muttered, peering into the black mouth. "Don't look like no place for devils." Jenkins didn't answer. He stood with his rifle half-raised, breathing steady but shallow. He had hunted these woods since he was a boy. He knew that animals had a rhythm, birds, squirrels, even coyotes. But what unsettled him now was the absence of that rhythm. The den was too still, too empty. Sheriff Clyde knelt by the mud at the cave entrance. He brushed the earth with his fingers. Prints. Human. Not boots worn for farm work or hunting. These were deep, precise, spaced evenly, as if more than one set of men had come here in careful procession. His jaw tightened. He rose to his feet. "Keep your eyes open." The three stepped inside. The air grew cold almost instantly, thick with the damp scent of stone. Their lanterns swayed, casting stringy shadows across the walls. Water dripped from stalactites, each drop echoing louder than it should have. The ground underfoot sloped downward, narrow paths carved by centuries of runoff. Deeper and deeper they went, their footsteps muffled against the hollow air. And then the sound, faint, carried through the stone. A murmur. Not water. Not wind. Voices. The deputies froze. Earl clutched his shotgun tighter. Jenkins tilted his head, straining to catch every fragment of sound. And Clyde felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. The voices were low, rhythmic, like chanting. Words not spoken in English. Words with edges that rasped like stone grinding against stone. The deputies glanced at Clyde for orders. But the sheriff stood perfectly still, heart pounding. He wanted to tell them to turn back, to ride home as if nothing had been found. But his pride kept his mouth shut. He was the law here. If there were men meeting in this cave for unlawful acts, he had to see it with his own eyes. Slowly, he motioned them forward. They followed the curve of the cavern until the walls opened wider, spilling into a chamber cut by jagged columns. And across that chamber, half hidden by shadow and smoke, they saw them. Figures. 7, maybe 8. Cloaked in black, standing in a circle around a crude stone slab. The slab itself was stained dark, though in the quivering lantern light it was hard to say with what. One of the figures raised both arms, chanting in that same guttural tongue. The others echoed. Their voices rose and fell in perfect rhythm, strange and hypnotic. Earl swallowed loudly. Jenkins shifted his boots on the stone, unsure whether to lift his rifle. Clyde's jaw clenched. "Not a word," he whispered harshly. They crouched in the shadows, just at the rim of the chamber, watching, listening. Their lantern light was dim enough not to betray them, for now. Minutes passed as the chant continued, spilling like a tide against the stone walls. And then, with a sudden shout, the lead figure brought something forward from the edge of the slab. A goat, bleeding in panic, its legs bound. Earl gasped. Clyde pressed a firm hand against his arm before he gave them away. The chant grew louder, louder. And then the knife. The movement was swift, practiced, merciless. Blood spilled across the slab, running in dark rivulets toward grooves that seemed carved deliberately to catch it. The goat stiffened, shuddered, and fell still. The three men in the shadows didn't breathe. Clyde had seen death before, murders, accidents, farm wounds that ended worse than they began. But this was different. Death here wasn't accidental. It wasn't justice. It was offering. The chanting slowed, tapering into silence. One by one, the cloaked figures knelt, pressing their hands into the blood as though consecrating themselves to it. At that moment, Clyde understood that this wasn't a crime ring or drunken hillfolk playing at superstition. This was something organized, something ancient, and they, standing in the shadows, were far too deep inside to walk away unnoticed. A voice carried across the chamber, low, rasping, commanding. Not from the leader, but from somewhere deeper yet. A voice that didn't sound bound to a single throat, as though the stones themselves were answering. The figures raised their heads. In unison, their chanting began again, louder this time, echoing down every corridor. Earl trembled. Jenkins cursed under his breath. And Sheriff Clyde, for the first time in his career, knew the law had nothing to do with what he'd just witnessed. This was not the business of men. This was something else entirely. And though none of them realized it yet, by stepping into Devil's Den that morning, they had already crossed a line there would be no return from. The men set out under the shroud of darkness, their boots crunching the gravel path with a tension that matched every breath they exhaled. The lanterns swayed in their hands, weak circles of light against an expanse of forest that seemed to devour it instantly. Sheriff Clyde Kinslow led, jaw locked, eyes scanning the tree line as if the shadows themselves might break into movement. Devil's Den at night was not the same place it was by day. The forest pressed tighter. The air thickened. Sounds traveled strangely. A whippoorwill's call ricocheted unnaturally, half familiar, half distorted. It was as if the land itself bent every noise into a whisper only it understood. As the men descended toward the first cave mouth, they saw it. Firelight. Dim, flickering in the hollows, bending and reshaping against limestone walls. No campfire would burn in such a hidden place at such an hour. Whatever was happening, it was happening now. Clyde motioned for silence, one hand raised. The men crouched low, pressing behind cedar bushes slick with dew. The sheriff carefully shifted to peer through the branches. What he saw rooted him cold. Beneath the lip of the cave, a circle of figures stood, cloaked in long robes dark as pitch. 11, maybe 12 of them. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, their forms illuminated by torches held aloft. At the center of the circle lay a flat slab of rock, raised slightly from the earth, its edges wet with something that caught the firelight in crimson glints. On that stone slab, motion stirred, no longer animal bones, but something worse. A goat, young, struggling weakly against ropes binding it in place. Its bleats were muffled under the low roll of chanting. The cadence rose and fell like a tide, every voice synchronized, grinding against the nerves of those listening. The sheriff's men shifted uneasily. One clutched his rifle, so tight his knuckles blanched. Clyde's throat burned, but he did not look away. The chanting swelled. A single figure stepped forward, taller than the rest, though equally hooded. From beneath his cloak, he drew a long knife. Its blade reflected the torchlight bright as a star. Clyde knew what was coming before it happened. The figure raised the blade, angled it downward, and with a sudden, decisive strike, the goat's cry was cut short. Silence followed, heavy and vast. Then the chanting rose again, louder, triumphant, even exultant. The torchlight flared as the knife was lifted high, dripping red, streaked from hilt to tip. The sheriff's heart pounded against his ribs. He had seen killings, violent, brutal, but never dressed in this kind of ritual. Never celebrated. The figure leaned down, pressing the blade to carve into the goat's side. The blood spilled across the slab, running down grooves that looked too intentional to be natural. Channels had been carved into the rock itself, channels that funneled the blood away, down into the soil, as if feeding the earth. Clyde's deputy Ellis choked back a sound. The sheriff's hand shot out, gripping his arm hard, warning silence. But it was too late. One of the hooded figures turned. Then another. Slowly, as though a current of awareness had spread through the circle. Their heads pivoted toward the ridge, toward the hidden men. The chanting stopped. For a heartbeat, only the sound of a rushing creek in the distance filled the night. Then, in perfect unison, 12 torches lifted and swung toward the darkness, focused on the sheriff's ridge. They had been seen. Clyde hissed low, back. Now. The men retreated fast, boots sliding against loose stone, lanterns bobbing. Behind them, the circle erupted, not in screams, not in chaos, but in something worse. A steady chant resumed, deeper, slower, as though marking the hunter's flight with deliberate rhythm. The sheriff and his party didn't stop moving until they reached the treeline. Breathless, drenched in sweat, they collapsed against their rifles, sucking air. What in God's name was that? Jack croaked, eyes wild. Clyde didn't answer. His mind was knotted with the image of the stone, the channels, the knife glinting as it caught the fire. He had no words that would make sense of it. But Lydia Harper would have. That same night, as the sheriff returned, restless and pale, Lydia woke from uneasy sleep. She rose, crossed to her window, and looked toward the dark outline of Devil's Denver. From her vantage point, she could see faint orange glimmers flickering on the horizon, the fires of ritual. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her skull, "When the fire comes to the rocks, child, keep inside, for it is not for us. It is for the land, and for those beneath it." Sleep would not return to her that night. She sat awake in her chair, listening to the distant roll of thunder that wasn't thunder at all. The sheriff's return to town did nothing to quiet the tension. Word spread quickly that he'd seen them. Hooded men, torches, a right carved in blood. But to whom he reported was as dangerous as what he had found. If it were mere law, he could have rounded up a posse, dragged the guilty before a courtroom. Yet he knew this was no band of drunks or thieves. This was organized, deliberate. It had roots possibly older than the town itself. And if that were true, then perhaps the very men he'd looked to for help might be the same men wearing hoods beneath the cave. Clyde slept not at all that night, his rifle across his knees. The following morning, he gave no public report, only a warning. Stay away from the den, farmers grumbled, demanding answers. Preachers thundered louder from pulpits, branding it proof of Satan walking in their midst. Yet the sheriff spoke nothing, his silence thick as stone. Still, whispers had a life of their own. Young boys dared each other to creep nearer the caves. Mothers forbade their children from playing in the woods. And the town itself seemed split, half fearful, wishing the matter buried, the other half demanding confrontation. Among them was Lydia. By afternoon, she stood at her window, watching as Clyde rode slowly past on horseback, his face tight, his brow shaded deep. She knew then what the town did not. The sheriff had seen too much. And the more he pressed, the more the mountain would swallow him. Because Devil's Den did not give up its secrets easily. And when it did, blood always followed. By dawn, Sheriff Clyde Kinslow was already pacing the courthouse steps, boots grinding against the stone as the morning sky burned faintly orange over Bentonville. He had not slept, but his decision weighed heavier than sleep ever could. What he had seen in Devil's Den, the cloaks, the chants, the blade, was not something that belonged to a sheriff's logbook. Writing it down on paper felt like an invitation for it to spread. And if he spoke openly, there was no telling whose ears would carry it where. So he chose silence, though silence never lasts long in the Ozarks. By noon, townsfolk were already pressing him for details. Farmers leaned near, whispering beneath their beards. Mothers whispered louder in kitchens, faces pale, too nervous to let their children wander down dusty lanes. And though Clyde offered only measured warnings, stay clear of Devil's Den, it's not safe, he could feel suspicion tightening around him like barbed wire. But there was one person who would not settle for silence. Lydia Harper arrived at his office that afternoon, dressed in plain cotton, her dark hair tied back, eyes sharp and steady. She was not a woman easily overlooked, though life had pressed hardship into her features. The sheriff, tired as he was, almost turned her away. But her presence carried a weight that would not be ignored. "You saw them," she said simply, hands folded in front of her. Clyde stiffened. "Ma'am, I don't know what you've heard around town, but—" "I don't need gossip," Lydia cut him short. Her voice was quiet, deliberate. "I've heard the stories since I was a girl. What's in that hollow? It's not new. You know that, don't you? It's been there all along." The sheriff studied her. She wasn't asking with curiosity. She was speaking with the knowledge of someone already certain. "And how exactly would you know that?" he said. Lydia's gaze didn't waver. "Because my grandmother was there the last time it surfaced. She saw men gather at the Denver. She swore it would come again. If the chanting has returned, if blood is already being spilled, then this isn't just mischief. It's the ritual waking again." The sheriff remained still, his jaw tightening. "I don't have room for ghost stories, Lydia. Not when blood's already on stone." "That's exactly why you need room for them," she replied. For the first time since coming out of the caves, Clyde felt something shift inside him. He had dismissed most old tales in his years as sheriff, but Lydia's words cut too close to what he had seen with his own eyes. The carved rock wasn't decoration. The channels for blood weren't improvisation. This had architecture, history, and maybe intention. Lydia leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You have to know, some men won't help you stop it, because some men are a part of it." The truth in her words was like iron. Clyde had already suspected as much. The hooded figures, organized, disciplined. They weren't outsiders wandering from the next county. They were locals. Men who knew the land intimately. Men who could melt into the community by day, only to take up robes by night. That realization gnawed at him harder than the ritual itself. Because if Devil's Den had its hands inside Bentonville, then who could he trust? Deputies? Judges? Even his own friends from town? He said nothing to Lydia, only folded his arms and turned from the window. But his silence was answer enough. That night, as dusk slipped down the ridges, Clyde did not call for more men. He knew better than to start a battle blind. Instead, he saddled his horse alone and rode out beyond the hollow, but not into it. He circled the den from higher ridges, stopping often to watch. The forest trembled with quiet sounds, owls hunting, leaves hissing under the night wind. But his eyes locked on the ridgeline fire once more. The ritual flame had returned, just as it had before. And once again, the chant drifted faint, rolling in rhythms made to be felt rather than understood. He had not imagined it. The ritual was alive and ongoing. When he returned, midnight pressing heavy on him, he found Lydia waiting outside the jailhouse door. She carried no lantern, no shawl, only attention that made clear she had expected him back this late. "You saw it again," she said. The sheriff removed his hat, weariness written across him. "It isn't stopping." "They don't stop," Lydia whispered. "Not until it takes something bigger. Animals are only the beginning." Her words struck him hard. He didn't want to believe them, but he had seen progression too many times. Petty theft becoming armed robbery, drunken quarrel becoming blood feud. Darkness always escalated when given space. If goat's blood flowed this week, what would rest on that flat stone tomorrow? The answer sat between them in silence. That very next morning, the first human signs appeared. A boy of 13, the son of a local farmer, was found wandering back from the edge of Devil's Den, dazed and trembling. His shirt was ripped, his feet caked in mud. His eyes carried the hollow stare of someone who had seen beyond what he could name. His father brought him to town, half carrying him across the square. The boy could not give full words, only fragments. Voices circle fire, again and again, like a broken record. The town exploded with whispers, and for the sheriff, the truth could be hidden no longer. A child had seen it. A child had been touched by it. And every gossiping porch, every chapel pew, every diner counter now hummed with fear that what lay in the mountain would soon crawl into their own lives. Clyde posted guards on the courthouse steps. He walked Main Street twice, rifle hung in plain view. But none of it settled the air. If anything, fear only deepened. And Lydia, watching all this unfold, knew it was only a matter of time before the ritual demanded its true due. Because her grandmother had warned her long ago, when the fires burn at Devil's Den and the voices chant in unison, they won't stop with beasts. They will take the willing, and then they will take the unwilling. The morning after the boy was found, Bentonville woke to a town divided. Half the townsfolk hurried to church pews, desperate for sermons that would promise protection. The other half gathered on porches, muttering suspicions about who among them might have been standing hooded in those caves. Fear was not silent anymore. It was a living thing that moved through the streets, curling into every corner like smoke. Sheriff Clyde Kinslow watched it unfold from the courthouse window. His men drifted uneasily in and out of the office, none daring to ask the question that sat on every tongue. Who in town is part of it? The sheriff had no answer. At least, not one he could give, because the truth rattled inside him like stones in a jar. The ritual was old, organized, hidden in plain sight, which meant the faces he had seen masked beneath hoods last night could belong to anyone he shook hands with in daylight. A merchant, a preacher, a deputy, even men he owed favors to. That was the worst of it, not knowing what mask lay behind familiar smiles. As he brooded, Lydia Harper climbed the courthouse steps. She carried no fear in her stride, though her eyes betrayed the cost of sleepless nights. She entered his office without hesitation. "You can't keep this quiet any longer," she told him flatly, closing the door. Clyde glanced up, stone-faced. "You think I don't know that? Boys babbling about what we already saw. But if I accuse the wrong men, half the county explodes in blood before nightfall." "They've already spilled blood," Lydia countered. "And if you stand by waiting for them to show more, all you'll have left to protect is the aftermath." The sheriff leaned back, rubbing his temples. He'd never been a man to let words cut him, but hers found their mark. He saw again the circle in the cave, the blade carved deep, the chant pulsing with something heavier than worship. And he knew she was right. Yet if he turned this into a war, it wouldn't be one the law could win. These weren't rustlers or bootleggers. This was deeper, older. That's when Lydia braced herself and spoke the truth she had sworn never to repeat. My family was tied to it once. Clyde froze, his eyes narrowing. Lydia's voice trembled, but held steady. When my grandmother was a girl, her brother was drawn into it. Back when the den first earned its name. He was 19, restless, and he joined their gathering. She said he never came back the same. Said it turned his heart dark, turned his nights longer than day. He vanished a year later, and she swore the den had taken him. The words rippled through the sheriff like a stone dropped into still water. He saw in Lydia's expression no hint of deceit. Instead, only the raw burden of carrying that memory alone all these years. She made me promise never to go near it, Lydia continued. She said the ritual runs through generations. That the men who stand hooded there today are kin to the ones who stood there decades ago. They don't die off, Sheriff. They pass it down. The sheriff lowered his head, exhaling slow. Suddenly, everything sharpened. The precision of the carvings, the unity of the chants, the sense of permanence in the very air. He had stumbled not upon a passing trouble, but upon something sown into the very soil. "Why tell me now?" he asked, voice low. "Because I've kept silent too long," Lydia said. And silence is exactly what they count on. For a long moment, the two sat in heavy quiet. Only the creak of the courthouse would breaking it. Finally, Clyde looked up. "If what you say is true, then this ain't just a matter of the law. It's a matter of the land itself. And law don't reach that deep." "It can," Lydia pressed, "if you're willing to bleed for it." The sheriff's jaw set, heavy with decision. He had always been a man who weighed things slow. But time was running thinner. Each day the den breathed fire. That evening, the tension cracked further. A farmer's wife failed to return from drawing water at dusk. By nightfall her body was found at the edge of a ravine near Devil's Denver. Not torn like an animal's prey, not robbed like a victim of thieves. Her throat slit clean, her blood drained onto the earth. In her hand, still clenched stiff, was a pine sprig. Ordinary at first glance. But any Ozark native knew pine was placed on graves by tradition. This had not been slaughter. It had been sacrifice. The town convulsed. Preachers shouted of hellfire. Men muttered about vigilante justice. Families boarded windows, lit lanterns through the night, clutching rifles. Fear had slipped free of the caves and into the streets. Sheriff Clyde Kinslow knew then. The ritual was escalating. It had crossed the line Lydia predicted. It was reaching for people now. That night, he didn't wait for deputies or townsmen. He went to Lydia's boarding house and knocked without care for the hour. She answered in her shawl, unsurprised to see him. "They've taken their first," he said simply. Lydia didn't blink. "Then the circle will grow bolder. Animals, then wanderers, then their own. They believe blood ties the living to the land. And the more willing they make the earth drink, the longer their power lasts." The sheriff, for once, didn't scoff at talk of belief. He had seen enough to learn that belief itself, when shared by enough, could move mountains or drown them in blood. He stepped closer. His voice was gravel. "Then we go into the den again. Not to watch, to drag them out." Lydia's eyes met his, steel for steel. "If you do, Sheriff, you'll have to be ready to face men you know. Men the law alone won't break." "That's fine," Clyde said, "'cause I'm not walking in there for law. I'm walking in there for what's right." The resolve in his tone was heavier than any badge on his chest. Lydia nodded slowly, sensing in him the shift. The line between caution and confrontation had been crossed. And Devil's Den, waiting silently in the hills, seemed to know it. The fires that burned that night shone not dim as before, but bright, like invitations cast against the sky. The ritual did not fear exposure. It was drawing them in. And both Lydia and Clyde, though they knew it meant standing on the edge of ruin, were answering its call. The morning after the farmer's wife was found, Bentonville was no longer a quiet town in the shadow of a mountain. It was a town split open by fear. Doors that once stood open now locked at dusk. Men carried rifles not just into fields, but into the heart of town. The church bells rang not for worship, but as warnings, metallic cries reminding everyone that the shadow of Devil's Den had stretched farther, darker, than anyone dared believe. Sheriff Clyde Kinslow sat at his desk, hat in hand, staring through the dusty courthouse window while the weight of the decision pressed into his chest. He could not sit idle, not anymore. Blood had been spilled, and with it, the boundary shattered. The ritual was no longer a secret act hidden beneath limestone. It was a war waiting at his doorstep. But how do you go to war when the enemy hides behind familiar faces? He rose slowly, jaw set. He knew he couldn't march a crowd into those caves, not when trust had eroded past recognition. If half the town feared the ritual, the other half could be kneeling at its altar. No, he needed something smaller, quieter. Men who answered not to tradition, not to superstition, but to principle. Men willing to stand when others fled. That afternoon, he began his search. The first was Tom Weaver, a farmer with hands scarred by years of plowing sandstone, a man who had no love for the old tales. His only son had once disappeared for 2 days in the woods near the den, returning pale and mute of what he'd seen. Tom had never forgiven the Hollow for taking him, nor forgiven the silence that followed. When Clyde asked, Tom didn't hesitate. He gripped his rifle and nodded. The second was Reverend Paul Darnell, a preacher younger than most expected, barely 30, restless with fire in his sermons. He had always warned the congregation that evil walked not as horned devils, but as neighbors who cloaked themselves in ritual to mask their sins. To him, what the sheriff described was not superstition, but proof of his words. If Satan takes root, he said firmly, it's our duty to tear it out. His Bible, heavy and worn, became his second weapon beside the lantern he carried. The third was Harlan Pike, a quiet trapper who rarely spoke in town. Folks called him strange, a man too accustomed to isolation. But Clyde knew better. Harlan understood the woods, the caves, the silent language of the land. If anyone could move through Devil's Den unseen, it would be him. When asked, Harlan simply loaded his rifle, slid on his leather coat, and joined without a word. By nightfall, 5 men, including Clyde, stood together in the dim confines of the sheriff's office. And at the edge of the room, Lydia Harper, though tasked with no rifle, no badge, no sermon, stood with them as well. You don't belong in the caves, Clyde told her, his voice quiet but firm, the way a man speaks to someone he fears for. But Lydia did not flinch. You'll need me. You can see what's before you, Sheriff, but you don't understand the meaning of what you're looking at. They carved those stones for reasons, spoke those chants for memory. Without someone who knows, all you'll do is stumble blind. Tom frowned. You mean you know their ways? I know enough, Lydia said, her gaze steady. Enough to understand what my grandmother feared. Enough to know they won't stop until they've taken someone willing. The room fell quiet. Each man recognized the risk in what she said, and the price if they failed. The sheriff finally spoke. Then we move tomorrow night. We've waited too long already. If they're growing bolder, then the den's fixing to take more. We meet at sundown at Miller's Creek and cut through the hollow from there. Nobody knows but us. Heads nodded, one by one. Quiet oaths, quiet fear, but resolve all the same. That night, Bentonville slept fitfully. Lanterns burned through windows, dogs whined shadows. The mountain loomed indifferent over all of it. Clyde, however, did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, rifle polished, sidearm checked, every motion mechanical. But his mind kept circling the same memory. The cloaked figure raising his knife, the blood trickling down stone channels, carved generations deep. A ritual not meant to shock, but to endure. And alongside that memory ran another image, Lydia's defiance, her willingness to step into fire, though she knew its cost. He understood then that courage often wears the face of those who have lost the most, because loss leaves nothing left to fear. The following evening, the men met as planned. The ride to Miller's Creek was silent, hooves muffled in pine needles, lanterns extinguished until nothing but moonlight guided them. The den waited ahead, blacker than the night around it, its outline jagged against the pale horizon. From their ridge, they saw the signal, torches again flickering at the heart of the caves. But this time it was different. More torches than before. The circle had grown. Lydia, watching from behind the sheriff, drew a sharp breath. They're calling others in. Clyde turned. What does that mean? Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from certainty. The ritual is reaching its peak. This isn't just animals anymore. They're readying for something larger, something final. The men exchanged uneasy glances in the moonlight, hands tightening on their rifles. Reverend Paul whispered a prayer beneath his breath, but it carried little comfort. From the caves below, the chant began again, rolling slow, like a tide dragging across stone. The firelight grew brighter, licking against the limestone walls. The figures moved deliberate, like gears in some ancient machine. And faintly, carried across the wind, a scream broke through. Not an animal this time. A human cry. The sheriff swallowed hard, a fire of dread climbing his spine. There was no more time. No walls left to hide behind. He whispered to the men at his side, "This is where we go." And they began their descent into Devil's Den, into the dark heart of ritual, uncertain if they would return at all. The descent into Devil's Den was unlike any journey the sheriff had ever taken. The night pressed heavy, muffling even the breath of the men around him. Their boots sank softly into damp soil, every step carrying the weight of consequence. Ahead, the flickers of fire painted the limestone a shifting orange. Behind them, the town and safety fell away, leaving only the echo of hymnless chanting. Clyde tightened his grip on the rifle. "Keep close," he muttered. "One sound out of place, and they'll know." Harlan Pike, the trapper, slipped ahead like a shadow. His body seemed to melt into the timber, his lantern extinguished, his eyes adjusting as if trained for this. He raised one hand toward the others, the signal to stay low. Through the veil of pine, the hollow opened in full view, and what they saw pulled every breath from their throats. The circle had doubled. Where once there had been a dozen figures, now nearly 30 stood robed and hooded, their bodies shifting with the rhythm of chant. Torches stabbed into the earth marked a perfect ring, glowing like teeth of an open jaw. And at the circle's center, on the stone slab Clyde had seen days earlier, lay more than one offering. A goat bound and bleeding, a lamb motionless, and beside them, terrifyingly out of place, a man. He writhed weakly, hands tied, shirt torn open across his chest. His face was swollen, his lip cut where he had been beaten beforehand. His muffled cries strained against the gag at his mouth as hooded figures restrained him against the altar stone. Clyde's heart slammed. His breath caught in his chest. All the warnings Lydia had given him, all the whispers of escalation, had come to this. "They've taken someone," Lydia whispered darkly at his side. "This is the next step." Tom Weaver cursed under his breath, rage burning. Reverend Paul clutched his Bible tighter. The chanting swelled, the circle's voices rising as one, like a great wave preparing to crash. Then, as before, one figure broke from the rest. Cloaked in black, taller than the others, his presence commanded the hollow with chilling ease. He raised his arms, quieting the chant with a single gesture. From his robes he drew the knife, its blade flashing in the firelight, slick with fresh sharpen. The bound man on the slab began thrashing harder, muffled pleas desperate, his head snapping side to side. Two figures pinned him down firmly, as though practiced in this terrible routine. Clyde's body coiled, every nerve screaming to move, to fire, to stop it. But he forced himself still, searching, calculating. 30 against 5. They couldn't storm blind. Even with rifles, they'd be overwhelmed before reaching the circle. Then Lydia's whisper cut through. "The leader. Aim for him. Cut the head. The rest will lose order." Clyde turned sharply. "And if the rest don't scatter?" Her eyes held his, steady despite the weight of fire beneath them. "Then none of you walk out. But if you let them finish, the whole mountain falls into their keeping." The chanting began anew, slower this time, rolling like thunder built from human throats. The leader raised the knife higher, its tip gleaming above the bound man's bare chest. That was it. Clyde exhaled hard, brought the rifle to his shoulder, and fired. The explosion of gunshot ripped through Devil's Den like a cannon. The leader staggered back, cloak tearing as the bullet clipped his shoulder. The knife clattered against the slab, missing its target by inches. Chaos tore the circle apart. Voices broke into screams, torches wavered, men scrambled. The hooded figures turned outward, their chant collapsing into confusion. For a moment, just a moment, the order was broken. "Go," the sheriff roared. Tom and Jack surged from a brush, rifles blazing. Reverend Paul raised his lantern high, its sudden light spilling across the hollow as he shouted scripture into the air, his voice cutting sharp amid the panic. The cultists snarled like cornered wolves, spinning toward the intruders with inhuman fury. A few broke immediately, scattering into the woods. But others drew hidden blades, rushing forward, their robes whipping through the firelight like shadows made flesh. Clyde charged, rifle raised, the echo of his boots snapping against limestone. He fired a second shot point-blank, scattering one attacker. Another figure lunged with a knife, but Harlan Pike, silent and swift, met him with the barrel of his rifle, dropping him cold with a single strike. At the altar, Lydia darted through chaos. She flung herself toward the bound man, clawing at the knots around his wrists with trembling hands. His eyes widened at her presence, hope flickering where despair had settled. Behind her, torches swung wildly, chants breaking into violent shouts. The leader, staggering but unbroken despite his wound, was already climbing to his feet, clutching his shoulder. His hood slipped back briefly with emotion, and in that split instant, Clyde saw the face. A face he knew. He staggered. Recognition cut like a blade of its own. A respected man from town. A man he'd spoken to countless times in daylight. A man whose family name carried respect deeper than the creeks themselves. Seeing him beneath the hood twisted the sheriff's stomach, broke whatever layers of protection he had clung to. "God help us," Clyde whispered. The leader's gaze locked with his, the recognition mutual. And then, defiant as stone, the man raised his bloody arm and cried out words the sheriff could not understand, but felt coil around his bones like cold iron. The circle, broken seconds earlier, seemed to tighten once more, voices rallying, chants rebuilding, as though the ritual refused to die even under fire. Beside the altar, Lydia cried aloud, "Sheriff, now." The knife was already clutched again in the leader's hand, raised not above the animal now, but above Lydia herself. Clyde didn't think. He didn't shout. He only moved. The next shot shattered the night. The leader staggered once more, the blade slipping from his grip, clattering useless across the altar stone. This time, he dropped to one knee, blood soaking his cloak, voice silenced mid-chant. A ripple broke through the circle. Without their center, half the cultists faltered, voices falling in sudden fracture. Several tore at their hoods, fleeing into the tree line. Others, driven by blind fury, hurled themselves forward. The hollow broke into violence, rifles cracking, fists striking, knives clattering stone. And through it, Lydia dragged the bound man free, pulling him from the slab as his sobs broke against her shoulder. Sheriff Clyde fought like a man who knew there was no other road. But every swing, every shot, drove him deeper into the realization of how far this ritual had already rooted. How many of those fleeing faces belonged to men he had shaken hands with in daylight. And worse, he could feel it. The mountain itself humming faint under his boots, the chants lingering even as throats fell silent. It wasn't just the men he fought against now. It was something fed and fed, growing in the cracks of the limestone itself. Something that would not die easy. When the chaos finally quieted, when gunpowder still hung in the smoke-thick air, a handful of men lay groaning on the ground, and the survivors of the circle had fled into the black. The leader's body, cloaked and broken, lay at the altar's base. But the stone slab was still red, and Sheriff Clyde, standing over it with rifle in hand, knew this was no ending, only the first break in a damn centuries old. The fires sputtered low as the sheriff's band staggered from a hollow, dragging the freed man between them. His wrists bled raw from rope, his face pale as death, but he was alive. Lydia's arm held him steady, her strength drawn from some deeper well than fear. Surrounding them, the woods crackled with retreating footsteps. Hooded figures scattered into the darkness like rats, their chants broken but not extinguished. For a moment, Clyde allowed himself to breathe. The leader lay back in the cave, his cloak soaked with blood, his chant silenced forever. But as the wind carried away the last echoes of battle, the sheriff felt no triumph. Only the low hum in his chest, the gnawing certainty that what they had done down there had not destroyed the ritual, but merely disrupted it. Harlan Pike moved at the front, rifle ready, eyes scanning the ridges as they climbed. His silence mirrored what each man carried inside: dread. Behind him, Reverend Paul walked with his lantern trembling slightly in his hand. His lips moved ceaselessly, prayers spilling soft but urgent, as though his words might bind together a town that had already begun to fracture. When at last the trees thinned and Bentonville's lanterns blinked faint in the valley below, the rescued man collapsed to his knees, consumed by sobs. Lydia held him, whispering gently, though her eyes never left the mountain behind them. She too heard it. The way silence pressed so thick it felt alive, the way the den seemed to brood even in retreat. "Sheriff," Tom Weaver said, his voice hoarse, "we ended it, didn't we?" Clyde didn't answer. His gaze lingered on the black horizon. He wanted to tell Tom yes, to let relief wipe the horror from the man's scarred face. But he knew better. He had seen the panic when the leader fell, but he had also seen the stubborn defiance that rose even as they scattered. A ritual rooted so long wouldn't vanish in gunfire. By dawn, Bentonville was awake with rumor. The men dragged the captive into town, bloodied and beaten, but alive. Proof that something unspeakable had indeed been underway at the den. Word spread with the speed of fire on dry grass. The sheriff and his men had fought hooded figures, had fired shots, had rescued a victim from sacrifice. At first there were cheers that choked the air outside the courthouse as townsfolk crowded for answers. Hope bloomed briefly, fueled by the notion that maybe the shadow had been cut down with the cult's leader. But by midday, hope curdled to unrest. Names began to surface in whispers. Which townsmen hadn't been seen the night before? Who came back with scratches hidden poorly beneath their collars? Who flinched when the church bell tolled? Faces turned suspicious, conversations broke sharp. Long-trusted men found themselves under wordless scrutiny, their wives pulled away in the marketplace, their children shunned on the schoolyard. The sheriff knew accusations could kill quicker than bullets. But he also knew silence killed slower and deeper. By evening, the courthouse filled with men demanding action, their fists striking the wooden benches, their words boiling over. "Ex-bosun one ain't good enough," a farmer spat. "Slice one head, the snake still writhes." Another shouted for hangings, another for exile. The preacher called for God's punishment, while others argued for the sheriff to march every suspect into the square. Clyde listened until he saw fury fester into violence among them. Then he stood, his hand slamming the desk with a sound that cut the hall to silence. "You want answers? So do I," he barked. "But understand this. If you think the whole den died last night, you're blind. You think this is over, it isn't. The ones who fled will gather again. And when they do, they'll do it smarter. These men don't paint their faces in daylight. They'll sit across from you in church. They'll tip their hats in town. They'll smile at your wives." Silence thickened. Clyde's voice dropped. "You'll know them not by their faces, but by the fires they keep." The courthouse quieted, but unease settled heavier than before. Whispers smoldered rather than burned. Suspicion took root like rot. Lydia, watching from the back, realized the sheriff's words, grim as they were, carried truth. Killing the leader hadn't cut the heart. It had only scattered seeds. And in scattering, perhaps the ritual would sink deeper than ever into the cracks of the county. That night, the sheriff returned home and set his rifle against the wall. He removed his hat and boots, but rest never came. His mind replayed the leader's face, the moment of recognition, the cruel certainty that he had not fought strangers, but kin to his own soil. He thought of the men who had fled, vanishing into hollows and barns, blending again into ordinary life. He thought of what Lydia had said, "It passes down." In the boarding house, Lydia sat by lamplight, staring at her grandmother's Bible, the one with notes scribbled in the margins, words written not in scripture, but in warning. Her grandmother had known all along that Devil's Den was less a place than a cycle. It demanded fear to live, silence to breed, blood to thrive. When the town went quiet again, footsteps came soft against her door. She rose, her breath caught sharp in her chest. The sheriff stood there, face drawn, eyes heavy. "We didn't end it," he whispered. "We only woke it harder." Lydia lowered her gaze, the truth too plain to deny. "Then the question isn't whether it returns," she said quietly. "It's whether Bentonville survives when it does." The sheriff exhaled through his nose, a sound close to a growl. Beyond them, miles away, in Devil's Den, the fires burned again. Dimmer, scattered, but they burned. Somewhere in the hollow, the scattered faithful pulled hoods back upon their heads, stitched wounds, whispered oaths. And among them, voices rose angry, grieving the fallen leader. But grief to them was fuel, for one leader's death did not end their ritual. It promised a rebirth. And as the torches guttered slowly inside the limestone's maw, the mountain seemed to pulse once more, breathing steady, waiting deliberately for the moment fear and silence would carry it forward again. The town simmered like a pot left untended. Outwardly, Bentonville woke and worked. The hammers rang in barns, the mule teams strained up hills, and children still chased dogs down dust roads. But beneath the rhythm of daily life, whispers had hollowed into the marrow of every home. Doors stayed bolted longer. Men carried rifles through fields. Women clutched their children close in the marketplace. And the sheriff felt the cracks widening by the day. Everywhere Clyde looked, suspicion lingered. Eyes that once tipped hats now darted away. The courthouse, once bustling with routine quarrels over fence lines and taxes, now hummed with arguments about who could be trusted and who could not. The rituals had become less myth and more shadow at every kitchen table, stretching through every seam of the town. It was in this shifting, fevered air that the betrayal came. It started quiet. Harlan Pike hadn't shown up for 2 days. No one had seen him at his traps. No one spotted smoke rising from his cabin past the ridge. For a man who spent his life in the wild, such absence wasn't unusual. Yet it itched like a thorn in the sheriff's gut. Then, one night, Clyde caught movement outside his own house. Lantern dim, rifle in hand, he stepped onto the porch and froze. Harlan's figure slipped quick through the trees, cloaked now, his face hidden by the same black hood Clyde had stared down at Devil's Den. The sheriff didn't fire, not out of hesitation, but out of bitter recognition. The man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with them in the caves, who had fought against hooded figures like a wolf among dogs, had been one of them all along. By morning, the truth struck harder. The cult hadn't just been pushed back, they had burrowed deeper. One of their own had infiltrated his circle from the start, fed them the shape of the caves, guided their steps through shadows. It explained how the circle had grown so quickly, how order had snapped back with unnatural ease even when their leader fell. They weren't uncoordinated. They were prepared. The sheriff's fury burned. But Lydia's eyes carried something colder when he told her. "I warned you," she whispered. "They don't choose strangers. They choose those the land already trusts. Families, neighbors, blood." Her words felt sharper now, because Clyde feared the truth in them. Harlan had been a loner, yes, but never suspect. And if the den's roots claimed him, how many others had bent low before those fires, disguising themselves beneath hoods only after darkness hid their faces? It was that night Lydia revealed the burden she had kept locked until then. "My grandmother used to say the ritual was strongest in families like mine," she confessed in candlelight, her hands trembling though her eyes fixed hard on Clyde's. She said the Harper blood once stood in that circle, not only once, but many times. She swore our family had fought it, but the land remembers, Sheriff. And sometimes a family doesn't get to pick what it inherits. The words cut him sharper than any blade in Devil's Den. Lydia was tied not only by witness, but by blood. The very lineage she bore had walked that hollow before her, spilling blood in the name of stone and soil. Yet the steel in her stare was unbending. "That's why I'll fight it, Clyde. Because if it grew out of my blood, then let it end with my blood if it must." The room fell quiet. The sheriff studied her long, the storm inside him heavier with every breath. He saw in her not only the stubborn fire of survival, but the crushing weight of a legacy she hadn't asked for. By dawn, another body was found near the outskirts of town. This one was no stranger, but a deputy, Ellis Maynard, his chest carved with symbols the sheriff recognized from the limestone walls. The message was not subtle. The den knew who opposed them, and they were cutting closer to the sheriff's own circle. Bentonville erupted in panic. Families prepared wagons. Mothers begged husbands to travel west. The preacher thundered in the square, urging men to take arms and burn the caves to ash. And though his voice boomed, the people's courage faltered. They feared not only fire in the hollow, but betrayal in their neighbors' eyes. Clyde knew this was the cult's true strength, not the knife, not the chance, not even the blood carved into stone. It was the corrosion of trust. The rot spread man to man until no one in Bentonville knew who stood with them or against them. And through it, the sheriff fought his own turmoil. He could not erase the face of the leader he had shot down at the altar. Respected, trusted, a man of daylight now revealed as a man of night. Nor could he ignore the hollowness that lived in him since recognizing Harlan beneath that hood. Now Lydia, too, stood with the shadow of inheritance pressed against her. And Clyde, though not tied by blood, realized he was bound by duty that ran nearly as deep. That evening, thunder rolled low through the sky, heavy and promising rain. The mountain seemed to brood taller against the storm, its silhouette blacker than the clouds. From the courthouse steps, Clyde watched the horizon. His deputies fewer now, their eyes restless, rifles always within reach. He knew what was coming. The ritual hadn't ended. The leader's death had lit a fuse rather than extinguished it. Bentonville was no longer waiting for the den to creep outward. The den was waiting, patient, for Bentonville to collapse inward. Lydia stood beside him, her shawl drawn close, her face pale against the stormlight. "They'll come again," she murmured. "And it won't be to hide. It'll be to claim what they think belongs to them." Clyde tightened his jaw, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Then they'll find me waiting." But deep inside, he knew the coming storm was not just weather. It was war. And as the first drops of rain struck the courthouse roof, Bentonville braced for the night. The ritual returned in full. The storm rolled in hard over Bentonville, battering shutters and rattling barns with a restless wind. Rain slashed the hillsides, hissing through the pines. But the storm was only a veil. Beneath it, the mountain breathed. Devil's Den pulsed alive again. The hollow glowed faint with torches, flickers swallowed by gray rain, yet unextinguished. Sheriff Clyde Kinslow stood on the courthouse steps, hat brim dripping, rifle cradle close. Around him only a handful remained. Tom Weaver, bowed but steady. Reverend Paul, Bible tucked against his heart as if it were armor. And Lydia Harper, shawl soaked but eyes unshaken. Bentonville had split, half of it hiding in locked homes, the other half gone silent, perhaps too silent, faces unseen since sundown. Clyde knew why. The circle had grown. "They're not hiding anymore," Lydia said, her voice low against the crash of thunder. "The storm, it's cover for them. They'll strike tonight." The sheriff nodded. "Then we don't wait for it to hit us. We take it back to them." The men exchanged tense glances, faces pale, fingers clenched white around rifles, but none argued. Each knew there was no life left in fleeing. Devil's Den would follow wherever they went. There was only one way to cut it from the land, meet it where it lived, and end it in blood, if need be. And so, as lightning flared across the ridge, they mounted horses and rode for the hollow one last time. Every mile pulsed closer, every hoofbeat drummed like a clock ticking down. By the time they reached the den's outer edge, the storm seemed to hush, as though the mountain itself drank the sound. The torches were visible, bright despite the rain, arranged not in tight circle, but in lines, processional, leading deeper into the limestone maw. Lydia inhaled sharply. They're not only calling to themselves. They're drawing the land in. This is the final right. The sheriff pulled his rifle tighter. Then we put it down. They advanced through dripping pines until the heart of Devil's Den opened before them once more. And what unveiled itself was worse than all nights past. The cave glowed not just with fire, but with movement. Dozens of hooded figures, their bodies swaying in rhythm, their voices pounding in unison. Far more than Clyde had seen before. The ritual had gathered allies unseen until now, spilling from neighboring valleys like shadows pulled by tether. The stone slab stood at the center once more, red-stained channels glistening despite rain. But this time it was not a stranger tied to the altar. It was a boy. A boy no older than 10, small wrists bound tight, his mouth gagged, his eyes wide with terror. The sheriff's chest hardened. This was no longer initiation. This was conquest. The circle roared its chant, bodies bowing low, then rising, each motion synchronized as though trained over centuries. And once more, stepping forward from their ranks, came the cloaked figure meant to lead the rite. The leader Clyde had shot down was gone, but this new one moved with equal command, face hidden beneath the dripping hood, knife drawn slow from the depths of his robe. Lydia gasped sharp. "That's him." The sheriff turned. "Who?" "My uncle," she whispered, the words torn raw from her throat. "My grandmother's brother, the one she swore the den had taken." The knowledge hit Clyde like thunder. The ritual was not resurrecting strangers. It was resurrecting legacies, pulling bloodlines back into bondage. Lydia's family was entwined, chains that stretched through generations. The boy screamed, muffled against the stone. The knife rose. Clyde didn't wait. He stepped into the open, rifle raised, his voice tearing against the chant. Enough. For a split second, the chanting faltered. Torches wavered. Heads turned. The leader froze, blade poised midair, before turning slow to face the sheriff. Beneath the hood, a grin cut broad with madness. Then chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked, flames wavered, screens broke. Tom fired into the circle, dropping robed figures who rushed forth with blades flashing. Reverend Paul raised his lantern high, shouting scripture until his voice split, his words striking like thunder over the storm. Clyde fired again and again, each shot tearing into the ritual, breaking both chant and body. Lydia lunged toward the stone slab, clawing the boy's ropes free as blood splashed around her boots. A cultist swung a knife, but she snatched the torch from its stand and drove fire into his hood, sending him shrieking into the mud. The circle fractured, but the leader pressed forward, knife gleaming, his chant rising alone, louder, fiercer, as though a single voice might carry all that was left. Lightning split the sky, illuminating for a heartbeat his face beneath the hood, weathered, wild-eyed, yet unmistakably Harper blood. He lunged for Lydia. The sheriff surged in, ramming his shoulder against the man, the two tumbling into mud and stone. The knife cut shallow across Clyde's arm, but met the man's jaw with bone-breaking force. Still the leader rose, hands clawing, mad strength surging from ritual and rage alike. The boy scrambled free into Lydia's arms, sobbing, as Clyde wrestled the knife, hand to the slab's edge. Rain poured, blood smeared across stone, boots scraping against the altar grooves carved generations deep. And then, with a final roar, the sheriff drove the blade back into the man who held it. The leader staggered, eyes wide, blood pouring as he collapsed against the very slab he had ruled, his lifeblood seeping into the channels meant for sacrifice. The stone drank it deep, red rivers winding down into the mountain itself. The chant died. The remaining cultists froze, their order broken, their power snapped. Torches fell smoking into the mud, robes scattered like fallen wings. Some fled into the night, shrieking. Others ripped hoods from their faces, familiar faces, once trusted in town, before vanishing into storm. When silence finally fell, broken only by rain on stone, the hollow seemed changed. The hum beneath their boots had dulled. The mountain, for the first time in weeks, felt still. Clyde stood panting, soaked in blood and water, eyes sweeping the ruined circle. Tom leaned against his rifle, pale but alive. Reverend Paul clutched his lantern, whispering hoarse prayers. Lydia held the boy close, her own face streaked with tears, though her gaze burned steady on the slab. "It's over," she said finally, her voice more hope than certainty. The sheriff looked down at the leader's body, at the blood soaking the carvings, filling the grooves. He knew the ritual hadn't been destroyed. It had been interrupted, broken, derailed. Whether it woke again in 10 years, or 50, or 100, he couldn't say. But tonight, Bentonville survived. And sometimes survival was the only victory the living could claim. When they rode back into town before dawn, the lamps of Bentonville flickered awake. Faces emerged from shuttered windows. Children cried. Mothers clutched them close. The sheriff said nothing as he carried the freed boy into his father's arms. No speeches, no promises. The mountain would always keep its secrets. But at least the stone drank no more blood that night. Lydia stood beside him, shawl clinging to her shoulders, her expression torn between grief and resolve. She knew the shadow of Devil's Den had not vanished. It lingered, patient, bound to blood. But she also knew they had faced it, and that mattered now. The storm broke with dawn, and as Bentonville stirred beneath the washed sky, Devil's Den sat quiet and brooding in the distance, its secrets buried for now, waiting, as they always had, for another time. And the sheriff, scarred and weary, kept watch, knowing too well that in the Ozarks, nothing buried stayed buried forever.
Have you noticed how every family hides secrets that seem to whisper from the past? Here, we uncover buried stories, family curses, and mysteries many would rather silence. But if you've made it this far, it means you feel that same chilling curiosity that holds you captive. Don't let these voices fade away. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow each new case we bring every week. Join a community that isn't afraid to face the darkest side of history. Get ready, the next secrets are already waiting to be told.